The fluorescent lights hum their fluorescent hymn, a sound so constant at Mercy General that most people stopped hearing it years ago. Megan O'Brien hears it. She hears everything. The ventilator wheeze from room for 12. The soft click of a medication cabinet closing 3 hallways away. The particular silence that falls when a patient's heart monitor shifts from sinus rhythm to something that demands immediate attention. She has learned to live inside that silence, to move through it like a submarine through dark water, undetected and necessary. It is 6:33 a.m. on a Tuesday in Norfolk, and Megan is charting in the ICU of Mercy General with the kind of meticulous attention that makes the medical records department weep with gratitude. Her handwriting is precise. Her medication times are documented to the minute. Her patient assessments include the small details that separate adequate nursing from the kind of nursing that catches deterioration before the monitor does, the slight increase in breathing rate that suggests fluid is building, the subtle skin mottling that whispers sepsis long before the fever spikes. She notices what others miss because she was trained to notice what others miss, trained in a different life, in a different uniform, in a place where missing details got people killed. The scars on her forearms are faint now, puckered lines that run from wrist to elbow, but she keeps them covered anyway with long sleeves even in summer. The limp appears on rainy days, a careful weight shift onto her left side, barely noticeable unless someone is looking closely, and most people are not. She does not want to be looked at closely. She wants to be the kind of nurse people see without actually seeing, the one who appears when you need her and fades when you do not, the one whose name you cannot quite remember but whose presence means someone is being taken care of properly. Dr. Marcus Sterling moves through the ICU like a man who owns it, because in practical terms he does. The morning rounds belong to him. The treatment decisions belong to him. The narrative of what happens in these beds is written by him and him alone, and nurses like Megan are merely footnotes in his story. He is tall in the way that privilege makes people tall, shoulders back, voice pitched to carry authority without shouting. His white coat has a monogram. His watch costs more than Megan's monthly rent. His wedding ring is platinum. Everything about him announces that he comes from a bloodline of people who never struggled, never doubted, never had to wonder if their rent would be paid or their identity questioned. This morning, Dr. Sterling is moving through beds with his usual entourage, 2 residents trailing like remora fish, 1 medical student trying very hard to look competent, and Megan standing quietly beside the chart for room for 16, the bed that contains Mr. Harrison, a 73-year-old retiree with stable chronic heart failure and no acute complaints. His ejection fraction is 35%, which is concerning, but it has been 35% for 8 months. His medications are optimized. His exercise tolerance is unchanged. His last echocardiogram was 3 weeks ago and showed no deterioration. Dr. Sterling stops in front of the room like a theatre director positioning himself on stage. He looks at the chart in Megan's hands with something like hunger. "We need a continuous cardiac monitor for room for 16, he says, not questions, states. New model. SurePulse 5000. The gold standard for geriatric cardiac monitoring. Megan does not flinch. She does not blink. This is the mask she has perfected over 20 years, the particular blankness that allows her to move through the world without leaving fingerprints. Mr. Harrison's current telemetry monitoring is meeting his needs, she says quietly. The standard unit we have is appropriate for his acuity level. It is not quite a question. It is not quite a challenge. It is a whisper against policy that is barely audible unless you are listening carefully. Dr. Sterling's jaw tightens. She can see it happen, the small grinding motion of teeth meeting teeth, the micro movement of muscle beneath skin that happens when something does not go according to plan. He holds her eyes for a moment, and Megan understands in that moment that she has made a mistake. She has revealed that she actually thinks about these things, that she reads the orders and questions them, that she has opinions about what patients need and what they do not. Nurses are not supposed to have opinions. Nurses are supposed to have obedience. The patient's insurance covers the monitor, Dr. Sterling says, each word precisely enunciated. The hospital protocol supports the upgrade for any patient over 70. This is standard practice. The hospital protocol does not say this. Megan knows because she read the protocol yesterday while eating a sandwich in the break room, alone, the way she eats all of her meals. The protocol says continuous cardiac monitoring is indicated for patients with unstable arrhythmias, acute coronary syndromes, or significant hemodynamic instability. Mr. Harrison has none of these things. The SurePulse 5000 costs $847 per patient per day for monitoring versus the standard unit at $127 per day. For a 7-day monitoring period, that is a difference of $5,000 that the hospital will bill to the insurance company, which will increase premiums across the board, which will eventually price people out of healthcare entirely. But Megan has learned the most important rule of hospitals: you do not voice these thoughts out loud. "I'll prepare the room," she says, her voice a carefully modulated instrument of compliance. "When would you like it installed?" "Immediately," Dr. Sterling says, and the word sounds like a door closing. He turns to the residents and continues his rounds, his voice bright again, professorial, the voice of a man dispensing wisdom to those fortunate enough to bask in his presence. Megan stands with the chart in her hands and her heart rate elevated and her breathing shallow, and she knows that something has changed, that the invisible ink of his attention is now written across her in ways she cannot see but will soon feel. The morning dissolves into the particular chaos that defines hospital work, codes that escalate without warning, families with questions that have no good answers, medications that need verification, vital signs that need interpretation, and always the acuity shifting like tectonic plates beneath the surface of seeming calm. By 11:15 a.m., Megan is in room 408 with a patient named Delores Chen, 71 years old, admitted last night with what everyone believed was simple dehydration but what the body sometimes reveals to be something far more serious. Delores is no longer breathing well. Megan hears it immediately, the shallow breathing pattern that suggests the lungs are filling with fluid that should not be there, pulmonary edema creeping into the chest like rising water. The pulse oximeter reads 88%, which is the kind of number that makes the alarm start sounding in your nervous system even before the monitor alarm sounds. Megan's hands know what to do because her hands have done this before, in a place that no longer exists on any map, in circumstances that she has been ordered never to discuss. Muscle memory takes over. She reaches for the oxygen setup with the precise economy of motion that comes from having performed these actions thousands of times in environments where speed meant the difference between consciousness and irreversible brain damage. The oxygen mask goes on with practiced firmness. The flow rate increases. She is calling out the vital signs even as her fingers are moving, because the body needs oxygen and the brain needs information and the moment needs to compress into the smallest possible space so that all the necessary interventions can occur simultaneously. SpO2 88 and dropping, she says, her voice steady, clinical, the voice of someone reporting data rather than concern. Breath sounds diminished bilaterally. I'm hearing rales at both bases. She's pulmonary edematous. The attending physician arrives 90 seconds later. Dr. Patricia Okonkwo is the kind of doctor Megan respects: quiet competence, no ego, a willingness to trust the nurses because she understands that nurses see what doctors cannot, that the continuous presence at the bedside creates knowledge that rounds cannot generate. She listens to Delores's lungs, looks at the monitor, and immediately orders the interventions that Megan has already mentally prepared for. Lasix for push, 40 milligrams, Dr. Okonkwo says. And let's get a portable chest X-ray stat. Megan is already moving toward the medication cabinet, already drawing up the Lasix in a 20 milliliter syringe, the needle already sliding into the foreport with the kind of smooth precision that makes the insertion look effortless to anyone watching. The medication goes in. The rate climbs. And within 40 minutes, Delores's oxygen saturation is back to 94% and the breathing has shifted from desperate to merely labored, from crisis to recovery. It is not dramatic. It is not celebrated. It is simply the work that needs to happen, and Megan does it with the particular grace that comes from understanding that the patient's recovery is not a performance for anyone else but a fundamental human obligation that transcends audience or recognition. By 2:06 p.m., the morning's attention from Dr. Sterling has dissipated into the background noise of the hospital, and Megan allows herself a small breath of relief. The SurePulse 5000 has been installed in room 416. Mr. Harrison is being continuously monitored by equipment he does not need. The financial transaction has been completed. Everything has returned to the particular obscurity that she prefers. She is sitting alone in the break room, eating a sandwich, when she feels the shift in the air pressure. It is the kind of shift that comes with predatory attention, a change in the electromagnetic field of a space when someone with focused intention enters it. Megan does not look up from her sandwich. She does not appear to notice that Dr. Sterling has entered the break room and is now standing approximately 8 feet away, ostensibly reaching for a coffee mug but actually watching her with the kind of intensity that precedes violence. She knows this look. She has seen it before, in different uniforms, in different countries, in the eyes of men who believed that authority meant dominion, that position meant permission, that anyone who questioned them had made a fundamental error in judgment. Dr. Sterling is calculating something. She can see the mathematics happening behind his eyes, the way he is reorganizing information, adjusting strategy, preparing his next move. The charting on room for 16 needs work, he says quietly, not looking at her directly, speaking as if to the empty air. Medication documentation is sloppy. We'll need to discuss that formally. Megan takes another bite of her sandwich. The bread is slightly stale. The turkey is the kind that comes from a package, mass-produced and vaguely mechanical in texture. She chews slowly, methodically, letting the moment stretch into the silence that comes before the real problem begins, and she understands with absolute certainty that the next weeks are going to require her to be exactly what Dr. Sterling thinks she is, a quiet nurse with no leverage, no voice, no power. She is wrong about the leverage. She is wrong about the voice. And he is going to learn, much later, just how catastrophically wrong he is about the power. They called her a ghost. They didn't know she'd carried a child through mortar fire for 3 miles. He had no idea what he was standing next to when he decided to break her. Dr. Sterling had perfected the art of public humiliation in exactly 47 seconds, the time it took to destroy a nurse's credibility in front of a family, a unit, and a career. What happened next didn't just silence the room. It ended careers. But first, she had to survive the rain. The ICU hummed with its mechanical rhythm on a Tuesday evening, fluorescent lights casting everything in that particular hospital white that made blood look darker than it was. Megan moved between beds with the invisible efficiency that had kept her alive in places Sterling would never understand. The Ramirez family clustered around bed 7, a Wheeler in the center, 3 daughters, 2 grandsons, a cluster of love and worry that filled the space around the monitored cardiac patient like a held breath. Megan had just finished administering the evening medications. Midazolam 2.5 milligrams, exact dose, documented, verified against the chart twice because that was how you kept people alive. That was the law. Dr. Sterling arrived during evening rounds like a storm front, expensive shoes clicking against the tile floor with the cadence of a man who'd learned that volume and tempo could substitute for competence. He moved past the other nurses without seeing them. His eyes found Megan and bed 7 the way a hawk finds movement in grass. She was updating the 4-pump when he approached, his white coat carrying the smell of expensive cologne and burned bridges. Nurse O'Brien. Not a greeting. An accusation. She turned, hand still steady on the pump. Doctor. He held the chart like evidence. His voice shifted into the register he used for audiences, slightly louder, slightly sharper, the tone of a man performing correction rather than seeking information. The Ramirez family stilled. The youngest granddaughter looked up from her phone. This is 2.5 milligrams of midazolam you administered at 1800 hours. He was reading from the chart she'd filled out. His finger moved to the medication log with the precision of a prosecutor. The order was for 5. Megan's hands went still on the 4-pump. The room's acoustic signature changed, the ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm on bed 5, but bed 7 seemed to hold its breath. She could see the Wheeler's eyes track between her and Sterling like she was watching a bird trying to land. The order was 2.5, Megan said quietly. Second line. Documented at 14:45 when it was written. Sterling's smile appeared like a door opening on something cold. Did they not teach you basic math in whatever correspondence school you attended? His voice carried across the unit, past the other nurses, past the medication cart, into the hallway where the night shift clerk looked up from her desk. The words had weight. They had intention. They had an audience, and he'd calculated every syllable. The Abweiler's daughter gasped. The granddaughter's face flushed with vicarious humiliation. Megan felt each of them watching her, waiting for her to crumble, waiting for the shame to do its work. She took one measured breath. The fluorescent lights buzzed above them like insects trapped in glass. She met Sterling's eyes with the kind of calm that came from having already survived the worst, and a single tear escaped down her cheek before she could stop it. She wiped it with the back of her hand without breaking his gaze. "I've seen men with more courage bleed out in the sand," she said, her voice low and flat as a discharged weapon. "You're just loud." The silence was so thick you could operate in it. The Abweiler's daughter made a small sound. Sterling's jaw tightened. Megan turned back to the four-pump and finished her documentation with hands that betrayed nothing. 30 seconds passed. Then Sterling was gone, his footsteps clicking toward the next bed, the next opportunity to perform his authority for an audience that still thought authority and competence were the same thing. What that audience didn't know was that Megan had the chart. What they didn't know was that she'd documented everything twice, that the medication order was legible and clear in the surgeon's handwriting at 1,445 hours, that Sterling had only glanced at it before deciding the narrative he preferred. What they didn't know was that she'd seen this move before, not in hospitals, but in places where lies had consequences measured in body counts. The next morning, a formal write-up appeared on the unit board. It was printed on hospital letterhead, laminated, tacked up with the kind of permanence that suggested it would live there for months. Disciplinary action, M. The Bryan, medication error, final warning. The message was clear enough. One more mistake and the mask comes off. One more time and you disappear. The nurses walked past it during shift change. Nobody made eye contact with Megan. Nobody said anything. At lunch, she sat in the break room with her tray. The room was full, Sandra from pediatrics reviewing a chart, Marcus from radiology scrolling through his phone, two respiratory therapists debating something about a ventilator setting. Megan set down her lunch container with the care of someone placing explosives. She sat at the corner table, the one nobody wanted because it faced the door. Within seconds, the room started moving. Sandra closed her chart and left without explanation. The two respiratory therapists suddenly remembered a consult. Marcus from radiology paused in the doorway, his marine bearing somehow making his hesitation more visible than movement. His jaw clenched. He wanted to say something. But he walked out anyway. The break room cleared within 47 seconds. The exact same time span it had taken Sterling to destroy her credibility. Megan sat alone under the humming fluorescent lights, and she ate her lunch with the focus of someone completing a mission. The tray was blue plastic. The food was hospital cafeteria, turkey sandwich, token salad, a container of applesauce that hadn't been opened. She chewed every bite. She didn't cry again. Crying was for people who had the luxury of falling apart. She'd given up that luxury a long time ago, in places with names she still couldn't speak out loud. That evening, Sterling cornered her near the supply closet. His voice was different now, quieter, which somehow made it worse. This was the voice he used for leverage, for the things he wanted to keep quiet. The smell of his cologne was stronger in the close space between shelves of gauze and saline. "You're a ghost here, Florence." He wasn't using her name. He was using a diminishment, the way you'd refer to a historical character instead of a person. No references before 2004. No credentials anyone can verify. One more mistake and you'll disappear for good. Megan's hand reached for gauze packages, and for the first time that day, her hands trembled. Not from fear. From a kind of controlled fury that moved through her like electrical current. How does he know about 2004? The year the Navy had erased her? The year she'd been ordered to disappear, to bury the person she'd been, to become someone else entirely. That year should have been invisible. That year should have been classified. Understand me, Nurse O'Brien. Sterling's voice dropped another octave. This was performance for a different audience, himself. I own this unit. I own the credibility here. One more error and you're done. She didn't respond. She selected gauze packages with methodical precision, watching her own hands move as if they belonged to someone else. Sterling waited for compliance, for tears, for submission. When none of it came, he walked away with the satisfaction of a man who'd established dominance through words. He had no idea that the silence he heard wasn't fear. It was the sound of restraint. It was the sound of a woman deciding whether to let him live. The next 14 hours passed with Megan moving through the hospital like a needle through fabric, in and out, connected but not touching. She charted medications. She verified orders. She sat with a patient in 8C who was having nightmares and held her hand in the darkness. She changed dressings. She documented everything with the precision of someone building a record that might matter someday. At 2,200 hours, the ER bay doors rattled. The rotor wash of a medevac helicopter shook the windows of Mercy General like something trying to warn them. The night shift went static. Everyone knew what that sound meant. Someone was coming in, and they were coming in hard. The announcement came over the intercom like thunder: trauma alert. 4-star general, chest trauma, ETA 8 minutes. Megan was already moving. The rotor wash hit the emergency bay doors like a physical blow, and every person in the trauma unit knew what that meant. 8 minutes had become 3. The Black Hawk descended through Norfolk's night sky with the general already crashing, his chest trauma spreading like an ink stain through his lungs, and Megan was moving before the wheels touched asphalt. The stretcher came through at a sprint. 2 flight paramedics, sweat-soaked flight suits, their voices clipped and precise: blunt force cardiac trauma, training accident, diesel injury at 47 miles per hour into a concrete barrier. No penetrating wounds. Conscious at pickup, altered now. BP 120 over 80 at scene, now 94 over 56 and dropping. Heart sounds muffled. We heard one clear S1, nothing after. No JVD on scene but tachy at 140. One of them held up the monitor strip. The rhythm was there but the pressure was gone. Tamponade. The general's own blood was filling the sac around his heart, squeezing it tighter with every beat, drowning him from the inside. Dr. Sterling stood at the bedside. His face was composed, his hand steady, but his eyes had the glassy quality of a man watching something he didn't understand unfold in real time. He listened to the chest with his stethoscope, his jaw working slightly, and Megan saw it, saw the exact moment the diagnosis failed to arrive, saw him pull the earpieces out and reach for the EKG machine like it might solve something, like he might need another test, another moment, another chance to understand what he was hearing. The general's pressure dropped another 6 points. 92 over 54. The monitor's rhythm had a fragile quality now, as if someone had turned down the volume on his life. That's tamponade, Megan said quietly, not to Sterling, to the room, to the facts that were inscribing themselves in real time on the monitor above the bed. Sterling's head snapped toward her. What? Muffled heart sounds. Pressure dropping with tachycardia. No rulls, no rhonchi. Blood filling the pericardium. He needs decompression now. For one moment, just one, Sterling considered it. She could see the institutional math happening behind his eyes, the calculation of whether to trust a nurse against the weight of his own uncertainty. Then the math lost. His hand moved toward the phone. Let me get cardiothoracic down from. Megan was already moving. Not asking. Not requesting. The spinal needle came off the cart in her hand, 25 gauge, and the 60 cubic centimeters syringe was there beside it, exactly where it always was because she'd restocked this cart 342 times in the last 5 years. Her hands were steady. Her voice was not a question anymore. It carried something else, something that had been buried beneath 19 years of scrubs and hush deference, something that had been burned into muscle memory in places that didn't exist on official maps. Step back, she said to Sterling, and he did. Not because she was right, though she was. He did it because the authority in her voice was the kind that soldiers recognize the way animals recognize a larger predator in the dark. She positioned herself at the subxiphoid area, just below the xiphoid process where the ribcage opened like a gate. The general's skin was cool, shocked, his breathing shallow and fast. She prepped the site with betadine in 3 quick circles, her movements precise as a locksmith opening a door, and then the needle was advancing at the 45-degree angle, angling toward the left shoulder, her other hand on the syringe, waiting. Waiting. Every second was pressure building, was the general's heart drowning in its own blood, was a 4-star officer with less than 2 minutes before his cardiac output became incompatible with life. The flash came. Dark blood in the hub, non-clotting, the arterial flush of pure accumulated hemorrhage. She was in the pericardial sac. "Got it," she said, and then the syringe began to draw. The alarms above the bed were screaming. The heart monitor's rhythm was tightening like a fist. 40 cc of blood came into the syringe, dark and viscous, each milliliter representing seconds of time the general had been accumulating toward death. 30 cc, 40 cc. The pressure on the monitor began to climb. 98. 102. 104. The rhythm that had been strangled and desperate suddenly opened up like a fist releasing its grip, and the general's oxygen saturation climbed from 78 to 84 to 91%. 90 seconds. The entire procedure, from decision to needle withdrawal, took 90 seconds. Battlefield medicine. The kind of medicine taught in training camps where the only hospital was a Black Hawk making evasive maneuvers through mortar fire, where speed wasn't a preference, it was the difference between a patient and a body. She withdrew the needle, stripped her gloves. Her hands were shaking now, the tremor coming through only once the immediate crisis had passed, only when her body released the pressure it had been holding in check. The general's blood pressure stabilized at 122/70. His heart rate dropped from 142 to 98. Normal sinus rhythm on the monitor, the rhythm of a man whose heart was no longer drowning. Dr. Sterling stood frozen at the bedside, his phone still in his hand, his face moving through a progression of colors like a sunset nobody wanted to watch. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. You do not have authorization to perform invasive procedures without physician supervision. Authorization, Megan said quietly, turning to face him. From who, exactly? She didn't wait for an answer. She knew what came next. She'd known it the moment Sterling saw her prevent his failure. The general was stable. The patient was alive. The monitor was normal. And Dr. Sterling was a man who had just watched a nurse, a woman with no credentials visible on her badge, no title that meant anything in his institutional hierarchy, no authority that could be found in any credential he understood, save a 4-star general's life in the time it took him to process the question. His phone was already out of his pocket as he turned away. She watched him step through the glass partition into the hallway, watched him make the first call, then the second, then the third. His voice was too low to hear, but his fingers were moving fast, tapping contact after contact, voice tight with the particular fury of a man who had just been exposed. Marcus Webb from IT stood in the corner, ostensibly restocking network cables from a cart, but his eyes had been tracking Megan since the moment she'd said step back. He saw Sterling making calls. He saw the intensity. He saw the calculations happening in real time behind Sterling's eyes, and something shifted in Marcus's posture, a straightening, a focus, the particular attention of a man who suddenly understood that the quiet guy in the corner had just become very, very dangerous. Megan checked the general's lines. Stabilized the pericardial catheter. Documented the 60 milliliters of blood withdrawn, the procedure start time of 2200 hours and 4 minutes, the procedure completion at 2200 hours and 5 minutes and 30 seconds. Everything clean. Everything documented. Everything correct in ways that Dr. Sterling would not be able to challenge on the basis of procedure or technique. She stepped back from the bedside and let the monitor's steady beeping be the only sound between her and the next catastrophe she couldn't see coming, the one that was already being set in motion by a man in the hallway whose entire career had just been reduced to something he couldn't explain to the 3 board members he was now calling The three people who owed him favors large enough that he thought they would forgive the woman who had made him look inadequate in front of a trauma that should have killed the patient on the stretcher but didn't. Within an hour of the general's stabilization, Dr. Sterling made his first call from the physician's lounge, his voice steady but edged with something sharper than concern. He dialed Marcus Chen, a board member whose recreational Xanax prescription Sterling had quietly overlooked for 3 years, the kind of oversight that created debt. "Marcus, we have a problem," Sterling said, his tone suggesting this was a shared crisis. "The nurse who performed that unauthorized procedure, she's a liability. We're lucky the patient survived. Another hospital, another outcome, and we're defending her in court." Chen listened. Chen understood. By the time Sterling hung up, Chen had already agreed to raise questions about staff competency. The second call went to Diane Rothschild, the hospital's chief of surgery, who had received 2 complimentary tickets to Nationals games, Sterling's season passes, offered as friendship. "Diane, I need your perspective on something as a peer," Sterling began, his voice dropping into the register of confidential physician-to-physician concern. "That nurse tonight, the one with a cardiac procedure, she performed a pericardiocentesis without attending supervision. Could have introduced infection, could have perforated the ventricle. We need to establish clear documentation that this was an emergency override, not standard protocol." Diane made a noise of agreement. She'd seen patients harmed by overconfident staff before. Sterling hadn't mentioned that the patient had lived. Details could blur when the narrative was framed correctly. The third call was to Richard Hayes, the hospital administrator, who owed Sterling a favor dating back to a confidential settlement involving a malpractice case that Sterling had testified favorably on. "Richard, I have a personnel concern," Sterling said, and then lowered his voice as if sharing something he'd reluctantly discovered. "One of our ICU nurses has some serious gaps in her background. Pre-2004, nothing. No verifiable employment history, no references we can validate. Given that she just performed an unsupervised invasive procedure, I think we need to have HR pull her file. She might not even have legitimate credentials." By 1745 hours, Sterling had made the anonymous call to the state nursing board, claiming Megan had practiced beyond her scope of practice by performing a procedure requiring physician supervision. By 1800 hours, he'd sent an email to hospital administration flagged a urgent, personnel security concern, noting the employment gaps and requesting immediate background verification. The email was worded with surgical precision, nothing explicitly accusatory, just questions. Questions that would require answers. Security arrived at Mercy General's ICU at 1847 hours. 2 officers in Navy uniforms, polite but immovable. "Ms. O'Brien, we need to escort you from the building," the first officer said, and she didn't ask why because asking would have been the reflex of someone with something to explain. She simply nodded, removed her badge, and followed them to the staff locker room where she gathered what was hers, a cracked ceramic mug that said "World's Okayest Nurse" in fading letters, a succulent with brown-edged leaves that had been dying for 3 weeks, and a single photograph in a frame so old the wood had warped. The photograph showed a girl with dark eyes, 8 years old, covered in dust and blood and the kind of fear that made grown men weep. Megan's hands didn't tremble as she placed these things into a cardboard box. Her jaw didn't clench. She simply packed the life she'd allowed herself to build at Mercy General into something that would disintegrate in weather. The combat boots remained in her locker, abandoned on the bottom shelf where she'd hidden them for 16 years, a pair of worn tan desert boots with laces the color of old blood, still stained with Iraqi dust and something darker. She left them there. Leaving them was easier than carrying the weight. By 1902 hours, Megan stood at a bus stop on Granby Street in Norfolk, rain hammering down with the kind of intensity that suggested the sky had a personal vendetta. The cardboard box was already going soft at the corners, the ink on her termination letter beginning to run together, words like investigation and scope and immediate release bleeding into each other until they meant nothing and everything simultaneously. She didn't read the rest. She'd seen enough. Rain soaked through the cardboard like water finding a wound. The coffee mug clinked against something hard. The succulent's brittle leaves scattered. The photograph, the girl with dark eyes, the child whose weight had anchored Megan to something human for 3 miles under mortar fire, whose face Megan saw every time she closed her eyes. The photograph began to blur as rain mixed with something that might have been tears or might have been rain, because Megan had trained herself not to know the difference. A bus hissed to a stop in front of her, pneumatic doors sighing open like a patient waking from anesthesia. The driver looked at her, a woman in scrubs, soaked, holding a disintegrating box, and didn't say anything. Megan didn't get on. She just stood there, letting the rain work its way through her clothes, through her skin, into the place where composure ended and something else began. The bus waited 7 seconds. Then it left her there. The boots stayed in the locker. The identity they represented stayed buried. And on Granby Street in Norfolk, a woman who had carried a child through fire stood in the rain with a box of everything she'd been allowed to keep, which was nothing that mattered. The rain intensified. The box disintegrated. The photograph of the girl with dark eyes became illegible, and for the first time in 20 years, Megan couldn't see that child's face even when she closed her eyes. But that wasn't the worst part. 2 days later, a 4-star general would open his eyes in an ICU bed and ask for someone by a call sign that should have died in Tikrit, a name that no one at Mercy General was supposed to know, a name that would bring the entire truth crashing through Sterling's careful architecture of deception like a breaching wave. The boots would come out of the locker. The identity would surface. And the quiet nurse who had stood in the rain with a cardboard box would become someone Sterling never should have tried to erase. The rain continued. The box fell apart. And somewhere in the darkness of a hospital that had just discarded her, a general's heart beat on, steady, strong, alive, because a woman he'd been searching for across 20 years had remembered exactly how to save a life when no one was watching. 2 days. 72 hours since Megan O'Brien saved a general's life with her hands and her muscle memory and a needle she had no authority to use. 2 days since Dr. Sterling made those phone calls, since she stood in the rain with a cardboard box, since her combat boots were left behind in a hospital locker like the identity she'd buried 20 years ago. But a general doesn't forget. A general wakes up. The ICU fell silent around bed 7. Not the gentle quiet of recovery. The dangerous quiet that comes when a high-ranking officer opens his eyes and recognizes where he is. General Marcus Bradley, 4-star, Joint Special Operations Command, carrier of the weight of 1,000 classified decisions, turned his head slowly, his right hand already reaching for the ventilator tube. A nurse moved to stop him. His eyes stopped her cold. "Where is Valkyrie?" His voice was hoarse, shredded by intubation, but the authority in those 3 words cut through the room like a blade through silk. "Where is my Valkyrie?" The room went dead silent. Nobody moved. The cardiac monitor kept its rhythm, steady, alive, exactly as it should be. But the nurses, Sandra, Miguel, the residents who'd been charting vitals, they all stopped breathing. Not because of the question. Because of the name. Valkyrie. That wasn't a nurse's name. That wasn't a medical term. That was a call sign. That was special operations. That was 20 years ago and classified documents and a little girl carried 3 miles under mortar fire and a soldier who was supposed to disappear. Sandra's pen fell to the floor. It rolled under the monitor stand and nobody bent down to retrieve it. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song overhead, indifferent to what they'd just heard. General Bradley's executive officer arrived within the hour. Commander Thomas Hayes, naval officer with the bearing of a man who'd seen every corner of the world and most of its ugliest secrets. He walked into the ICU with a tablet and a folder and a face carved from stone. He read the termination paperwork, Megan O'Brien, registered nurse, employment terminated for cause, all the lies Sterling had woven into official documents, and his hands trembled. Not from weakness. From barely restrained fury. "Sir, I have information." His voice was steady, but the tremor in his hands told the story. Senior Chief Petty Officer O'Brien received the Navy Cross for the Tikrit extraction. She was attached to Task Force 121, JSOC Direct. Her clearance level was... He paused. There were things he couldn't say in a hospital room. Things that lived in classified briefings and secure facilities. Things that stayed buried. A SEAL team leader stepped forward. Call sign Breaker. 23 years of active duty, 7 deployments, hand scarred from climbing rope and fast roping from helicopters. His uniform carried the weight of silent operations and enemies who'd never see his face. She carried General Bradley's daughter. The extraction went sideways. Enemy fire from 3 directions. Bradley's daughter was 8 years old. His voice didn't waver, but his jaw tightened. Valkyrie carried that child 3 miles through Jolin district. 3 miles under sustained mortar fire. The child lived because Senior Chief O'Brien refused to put her down. Refused to leave her. He turned to look directly at the general. Sir, you've been looking for Valkyrie for 20 years. She was here. At Mercy General. Working as a nurse. The silence that followed was the kind that comes from understanding something fundamental has shifted. The general's vital signs spiked, heart rate climbing, blood pressure rising, and alarms began to sound. The nurses rushed to stabilize him, but his eyes stayed fixed on that SEAL team leader. Where is she now? The next words nobody wanted to speak. Fired. 2 days ago. Dr. Sterling, he fabricated disciplinary actions. Had her escorted out. She left with a cardboard box. The room went colder than any ICU should be. Dr. Sterling was in the hallway when the general security detail walked past him. 6 personnel in Navy digital camouflage fatigues, each one moving with the fluid precision of apex predators who'd trained their entire careers for this exact kind of operation. The lead officer didn't say anything. Didn't need to. The look was enough. Sterling's face went pale. His phone was already in his pocket, but suddenly it felt like a lead weight. They knew. They already knew. We'll need to review all surveillance footage from the past 72 hours, the officer said, her voice like a tank idling in a garage. Where's your IT administrator? Sterling excused himself. Walking too fast. Heart rate climbing. If they pulled the footage, they'd see everything, the phone calls in the hallway, the fabricated discipline sessions, the moment he decided to burn a woman's career rather than face an audit. He moved toward the server room on the 3rd floor, the fluorescent lights overhead casting his shadow down the corridor like an accusation. His hands were shaking by the time he reached the door. Marcus Webb sat in that server room like a sentinel. Ex-Marine. 12 years active duty. Cybersecurity certification. A man who understood chains of command and also understood when those chains were being used to strangle the innocent. He had already been there when Sterling arrived in the ICU with those phone calls, already heard the panic in Sterling's voice before he even picked up the receiver. And Marcus had moved with the quiet efficiency of someone trained in data extraction and evidence preservation. Every frame from the past 72 hours. Downloaded. Backed up. Forwarded directly to an FBI field agent in Norfolk at 14:23 that afternoon. Sterling stopped in the doorway. I need you to purge the footage from the past 72 hours. System maintenance. Marcus didn't look up from his monitor. Can't do that, sir. It's a direct order. Not in my chain of command. Marcus leaned back in his chair. The motion was slow, deliberate, the kind of posture that doesn't flinch or retreat. Already forwarded everything to the FBI. About 20 minutes ago. They're reviewing it now. Sterling lunged. His hand reached for the keyboard, for the equipment rack, for anything. Marcus stood, 6'3" of Marine Corps muscle and the kind of moral clarity that comes from knowing exactly who deserves protection, and Sterling's hand stopped midair. One word, don't. It was enough. 2 hours later, federal agents escorted Dr. Sterling out of Mercy General in handcuffs. Not dramatically. There was no perp walk, no gasping nurses, no theatrical destruction. Just a man in a lab coat being guided toward a black sedan in the parking lot while his colleagues stared through windows and pretended they hadn't known. The board members he'd called scattered before the day was finished. Auditors descended on Mercy General's billing records. Pharmaceutical company representatives stopped answering their phones. The state nursing board received a folder 3 inches thick, fabricated disciplinary actions, falsified medication errors, witness statements from nurses too afraid to speak before today, all of it arranged with the precision of a military operation. Sterling's medical license was suspended pending criminal investigation. His wife filed for divorce. His country club membership was revoked. The Navy locates Meghan at a motel on Ocean View Avenue, 3rd floor, room 337, still holding that cardboard box, still wearing yesterday's clothes, still carrying the weight of an identity she'd been told never to speak aloud. A female officer in dress blue stood in the doorway. Captain Jennifer Reeves, Special Forces, the kind of woman who'd seen what Meghan had seen and survived what Meghan had survived. Senior Chief, it's time to come home. Meghan didn't speak. She simply stood and set the cardboard box on the bed, the box holding everything the hospital thought represented her, and followed that officer into a waiting Black Hawk helicopter that would carry her to a base and then to an office and then to a uniform she'd forgotten how to wear. 6 months later, she stood in navy dress blues in a commissioning ceremony, her uniform crisp, her posture straight for the first time in 20 years. The liaison to veteran healthcare. A position created specifically for someone who understood both sides of the fence, the military world and the medical system that was supposed to serve it. On her desk sat those worn combat boots, finally cleaned. The Iraqi dust was gone. The blood had been washed away. But the history was preserved, protected in a glass case that caught the afternoon light from her office window at the Pentagon. Next to the boots, a framed photograph. Her and Captain Sarah Bradley, the girl from Tikrit, now a woman in Special Forces insignia, now a warrior in her own right, both in dress blues, both finally allowed to exist in the same room, in the same photograph, in the same history. General Marcus Bradley shook her hand at the ceremony, his grip firm, his eyes wet. "You gave me my daughter back. Now let us give you your life back." Dr. Sterling was selling supplemental insurance policies from a folding table outside a strip mall in Virginia Beach. His medical license revoked. His network scattered. His name whispered in medical ethics seminars as the textbook definition of corruption. He wore a polo shirt with the insurance company logo. His smile was desperate, practiced. Nobody bought from him twice. Meghan visited Mercy General once, 6 months after her firing. She wore her uniform in dress blues, ribbons including one that made people's eyes widen when they recognized it. The Navy Cross. Senior Chief Petty Officer rank insignia on her collar. She walked through the ICU and the break room and past the nurses' station where she'd been shunned. Sandra from Pediatrics stopped mid-step, her mouth open. The nurses who wouldn't sit with her now couldn't stop staring. Marcus Webb was waiting by the IT office. He threw her a salute. Formal, perfect, the kind that acknowledged not just rank but sacrifice. She returned it. Neither of them spoke. Some things don't need words. She didn't stay long at Mercy General. There was work to do. Real work. Helping veterans navigate a system designed to confuse them, reforming the billing practices that had killed good people for profit, making sure no other senior chief would have to stand alone in the rain holding everything she owned in a cardboard box. As she left the hospital, she passed the supply closet where Sterling had cornered her during one of his earliest cruelties. The memory flickered. And then it was gone. It had no power anymore. Outside, Norfolk sunshine warmed the parking lot. The kind of light that only exists in spring, when everything broken has the chance to heal. Inside Mercy General, a ghost finally lay to rest. Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrub saving lives in the dark. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. We release stories like this every week, stories about the quiet warriors among us, the ones who save lives and ask for nothing in return. Leave a comment. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who had no idea who you really were? Share your story. And share this video with someone who needs to hear about Meghan O'Brien.